What would happen if I told you there is a real possibility that you are less capable of thinking today than you were 10 years ago? Not because of illness, not because of an accident, but because something you use several hours a day is literally redesigning your brain from the inside. And what is most disturbing is not that it is happening. What is most disturbing is that while it happens, you feel more informed than ever. That is exactly the problem. There is a thought experiment I want you to do right now. Think about the last time you truly read something long. A book, a lengthy article, an essay that required you to hold a complex idea in your head across several paragraphs. When was it? Weeks ago? Months ago? And if you tried, how many times did you have to go back to the beginning because your mind drifted somewhere else before you reached the end of the page? If that sounds familiar, you are not alone, and it is not a coincidence. What is happening inside your head has a name, a scientific explanation, and consequences that go far beyond not being able to finish a book. It affects how you make decisions, how you relate to the people you love, how you interpret the world around you, who you are when no one is watching you. And the answer to all of this has to do with a war you have been losing for years without knowing it existed. In 1973, a New Zealand psychologist named James Flynn discovered something no one expected. By analyzing decades of data from intelligence tests across different countries, he found that the average IQ of humanity had been steadily increasing throughout the 20th century. Generation after generation, humans were scoring better on abstract reasoning tests, more ability to solve problems, to think in categories, to recognize patterns. Researchers called it the Flynn effect, and for decades, it was a source of optimism. But then, something changed. Starting in the 1990s, in some Nordic countries, the first alarming data began to appear. Norway, Denmark, Finland. Countries with some of the best education systems in the world. The same places where the Flynn effect had been most pronounced were now the first to show signs of reversal. Average IQ had not only stopped rising, in some groups, it had begun to decline. Researchers were puzzled. There was no genetic explanation. Nutrition continued to improve. Access to education was greater than ever. What was happening? And here is where the story becomes truly unsettling. Because the answer that gained the most traction among scientists did not point to what humans had stopped having. It pointed to what they had started using. There are two systems in your brain, not metaphorically. In a real, documented, measurable sense. Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize in Economics, and one of the most influential psychologists of the 21st century, described them with devastating clarity. System 1 is fast, automatic, emotional. It operates effortlessly, without conscious intention, without you having to do anything. It recognizes an angry face before your conscious mind realizes you are even looking at it. It makes you dodge a falling object before you have decided to move. It is ancient, fast, and absolutely brilliant for what it was designed to do. System 2 is slow, deliberate, analytical. It requires effort, focus, and time. It is what you use when you calculate how much money you can afford to spend this month. When you try to understand a complex argument, when you evaluate whether a decision that feels right now could be a mistake in 5 years, System 1 is instinct. System 2 is reasoning. And now comes the part that should worry you. System 2 is exhausting. The brain knows this, and whenever it can, it delegates to System 1. Not because you are lazy, because that is how biology works. Deep thinking consumes energy, and the brain is a survival machine that has spent millions of years optimizing resource use. The problem is that we now live in an environment that has learned to exploit that tendency with surgical precision. Every time you open a social media app, there is a team of engineers and behavioral psychologists whose only goal is to get System 1 to take over. Not System 2. System 1. The impulsive, reactive one that does not analyze. The one that clicks before thinking. This is not paranoia. It is the business model. The attention economy works like this. Your screen time becomes data. Data becomes advertising. Advertising becomes money. The more time you spend looking, the more valuable your attention becomes. And to maximize that time, algorithms learn faster than any human can to identify what keeps your eyes glued to the screen. And what kind of content is that? Not nuanced content. not complex content, not content that requires holding multiple threads of thought at once. It is content that triggers strong emotions, indignation, fear, shock, surprise, immediate reward. A study from MIT published in the journal Science Times found that fake news spreads on Twitter, now known as X, 6 times faster than true news. Why? Because fake news tends to be more novel, more extreme, more emotionally activating. It hits System 1 with surgical precision. The algorithm is not deliberately lying to you. It is simply learning that emotionally charged falsehoods travel faster than complex truth. And it serves you what keeps you engaged. Think about it for a moment. Not abstractly, as something that happens to you, today, in your real life. How many times have you reacted with anger to something you read online, only to discover hours later that the story was incomplete? How many times have you shared something before finishing reading it? How many times have you formed a strong opinion in 30 seconds of reading? I am not saying this to judge you. I am saying this because that is exactly what the system was designed to produce. Now, consider something you may never have thought about this way. When you have a doubt, what do? You search Google, immediately, without trying to remember, without trying to reason, without giving your brain the chance to work. When you need to remember an address, a date, an actor's name, the year something happened, you reach for your phone before you have even finished formulating the question. This has a name in neuroscience: cognitive offloading, and in principle, it is not bad. Using external tools to store information is something humans have done since writing was invented. But there is a crucial difference between writing something down so you do not forget it and stopping remembering altogether because you know your phone will remember for you. The difference lies in what happens to knowledge when it is retained in your own mind. When you truly know something, that knowledge does not exist in isolation. It connects to other things you know. It creates associations, generates questions, produces new ideas, creativity, critical thinking, the ability to make complex decisions. All of that depends on having material to work with inside your mind, not in the cloud. If your brain is a kitchen, Google is the supermarket. It is fine to know the supermarket exists. But if your fridge is always empty, you cannot cook, and you have been emptying your fridge for years. There is another phenomenon acting in parallel, quieter but equally powerful. Eli Pariser, researcher and digital activist, called it the filter bubble, and it is as simple as it is terrifying. When you interact with online content, the algorithm learns your preferences. It learns what you like, what angers you, what you agree with, and from there, it starts showing you more of the same. Not because it wants to manipulate you ideologically, but because it wants you to stay on the platform. The result is that each user lives in a personalized reality. You see news that confirms what you already believe. You see opinions that reinforce your own. You see a world that constantly seems to agree with you. And that feels good. System 1 loves having its beliefs confirmed. It produces immediate comfort. But there is a cost that never appears in any notification. When you are never exposed to ideas that challenge yours, when you never have to hold a conversation with someone who thinks differently, when you never encounter information that contradicts your mental map of the world, System 2 is left without work, and like any unused muscle, it atrophies. The most brutal irony of the digital age is this: we have never had access to so much information, and we have never thought so little about it. A moment ago, I mentioned the inverted Flynn effect. I want to return to it because there is something researchers found that I consider fundamental. The decline was not uniform across all cognitive abilities. There were areas where performance remained stable or even improved. Fast visual processing, for example, the ability to react to brief, changing stimuli. And which area showed the most pronounced decline? Working memory, the ability to hold information in your mind while processing it, the ability to follow a complex argument, the capacity to read between the lines, detect contradictions, evaluate coherence. In other words, precisely the abilities you need to think properly. This is not a coincidence. It is an adaptation. The brain is plastic. It reorganizes itself according to its environment. And if your environment increasingly demands less deep thinking and more rapid reaction, your brain responds accordingly. It is not that you are less intelligent. It is that your intelligence is being specialized in something else, something the digital world rewards, and everything else is beginning to rust. Right now, as you listen to this, part of you may want to close it and open something else, something faster, something with more cuts, more music, more stimulation, that discomfort you feel when content does not change every 3 seconds, that slight impatience, that impulse to scroll even when there is nothing to scroll, that is evidence, not of boredom, of conditioning. And what is most disturbing is that this conditioning does not discriminate. It affects people with university degrees and those without them equally. Young people and adults, those who believe they consume high-quality content and those who do not. Because the mechanism does not operate at the level of content, it operates at the level of format, speed, the structure of how information is consumed. You can spend the day reading neuroscience articles in 2-minute fragments and walk away without having thought deeply about anything. The illusion of learning is one of the most dangerous side effects of overstimulation. You consume and feel like you are growing intellectually. But consuming is not thinking, just as swallowing is not digesting. So, what can be done? I am not going to give you a list of 5 habits that will transform your brain in 30 days. That would be exactly the kind of content we are criticizing. The immediate, the easy, the content that promises more than it can deliver. What I will say is something researchers on critical thinking have been repeating for decades, and which the noise of the digital world makes harder and harder to hear. Deep thinking is not recovered passively. It requires deliberate practice. It requires exposing yourself to ideas that demand you hold them in your mind for more than 30 seconds. It requires reading long texts without your phone nearby. It requires conversations where you do not already know what you think. It requires tolerating the discomfort of not having an immediate answer and staying with the question long enough for your mind to actually work. And it requires something that in 2025 has become almost an act of rebellion: conscious boredom. Boredom is not a system failure. It is the state in which System 2 activates. It is the moment when the mind, without external stimulation, begins to work on its own, connecting ideas, generating questions, imagining solutions. Boredom is the laboratory of creative thought, and we have almost completely removed it from our lives. Decades ago, humans waited in lines without phones. They traveled on subways without headphones. They were alone with their thoughts for minutes at a time without experiencing it as a threat. And those moments today, filled compulsively with content, were actually the moments when the brain consolidated what it had learned, solved problems without realizing it was solving them, and built the internal architecture of deep thought. I am not romanticizing the past. I am pointing out what we have lost without ceremony, without conscious decision, without realizing we were losing it. Because that is exactly how this process works. Not all at once. No dramatic moment you can identify as a turning point. Just a silent accumulation of habits that, together, produce a different kind of mind than the one you had 10 years ago. The question I asked myself when I found all this information, and now I ask you, is this: do you want that different mind? I am not asking you to quit social media. I am not asking you to throw away your phone. I am asking you to do something much harder, to start making conscious decisions about what kind of thinking you practice each day. Because thinking, like any skill, is what you train, and what you do not train disappears. The greatest cognitive threat of our time is not lack of information. It is the abundance of stimuli that convinces us we are thinking, when in reality, we are only reacting. And the difference between thinking and reacting is exactly the difference between being the author of your life and being a character moved from scene to scene by an algorithm. You decide which one you want to be. If you made it to the end, comment, "I made it," and I will personally reply. And if you felt it, subscribe to be part of it, and like it if you enjoyed it.